Hello, welcome to Chapter 2, Lifespan Development, Theories of Development. This is Mr. Emmer, your instructor. In this chapter, we're going to look at psychoanalytic theories, learning theories, cognitive theories, biological and ecological theories, and compare these theories when we take a look at development. Some of our objectives is we're going to take a look at some of Freud's theories, Erikson's psychosocial theories, weaknesses and strengths of psychoanalytic theory. We're going to look at Watson's research with Little Albert, operant conditioning, social cognitive theory, and learning theories, how they're used to explain development. We're also going to look at Piaget and Vygotsky, his concepts of scaffolding and proximal development. We're also going to look at information processing theory, important contributions of cognitive theories, and how do behavior geneticists explain individual differences, and what kinds of behaviors are the interests of ethologists and sociobiologists. We're going to look at Bronfenner's bioecological theory and make some assumptions about different families of theories of development. Look at what criteria do developmentalists compare, and what eclecticism is. So let's first take a look at what we're going to cover. We're going to take a look at psychoanalytic learning and cognitive theories as it applies to development, and look at biological and ecological trends. First of all, Sigmund Freud is well known for what's called psychosexual theory, and he basically coined the term libido, which is our internal drive for personal pleasure, is what influences our behavior. Basically, our unconscious process of the libido is what drives our behavior. Patient memories are also used as primary source material. So during therapy, they would look at childhood memories, trauma experiences. Another important development from Freud is what's called the three personality types. You have the id, the ego, and the superego. Best way to explain the id, the ego, and the superego, try to picture those cartoons with a little devil on one side and angel the other. Okay, the id is like the little devil. That's your selfish impulses, looking out for number one. Not always a bad thing. It has to do with self-preservation, but also it can be quite selfish. The superego is like the angel on the other side. It's looking at what's best for the community, what's best for society. This is a developed conscience that everyone carries. It's a social conscience based on the relationships we've built in our life. The ego is our brain that balances our selfish impulses with our conscience. And those are the three personality types. Freud proposed that hidden memories of traumatic childhood events are often hidden or repressed. Actually, there's a lot of more current research on this about the impact of traumatic events on a child's development. But memory researchers found that some adults who experience child abuse forget their memories related to abuse. And then they usually come back later as they reach adolescence or adulthood, because their brain is able or capable to process that type of information. Whereas a child, they're not able to handle this. Most people do retain traumatic memories. False memories may be created if repressed memories are explored. Specific training aids therapists use to recall concrete evidence for memories. I guess the key is when somebody brings up something, abuse from the past, that it's important that you respond in a way that you believe them, and you help them to unpack those memories. Here's a situation we could decide. Which of these two statements do you agree with? If I thought I have recovered a repressed memory of childhood abuse, I'd prefer to have a skeptical therapist who would educate me about research findings showing that such memories are rarely forgotten. Or if I thought that I have recovered a repressed memory of child abuse, I'd prefer to have a supportive therapist who would help me search for evidence of the abuse. Which do you think would be helpful? As a counselor, I would say you always want to err on the side of the student. You are an advocate for the student. You help them to work through what they need to work through. These are what's called Freud's psychosexual stages. And a cool thing about his stages is the libido is centered in a different body part at each stage. For instance, the first stage is the oral stage. Oral as in mouth. Notice a baby from birth to 1 year, everything goes in the mouth. The oral behavior is their way of discovering the world around them through their mouth. As an adult, oral behavior such as smoking or overeating, passivity, and gullibility might be because of unmet oral or unmet events at the oral stage. The anal stage has to do with basically pooping, toilet training. From age 1 to 3, that's when the child deals with, okay, it's easier to to poop into my diaper, but mom and dad seem kind of cool. I think I will impress them and do what they want. So it's kind of a need for learning to control defecating in order to please another person. The phallic stage has to do with more of the sexual organs, ages 3 to 6 years, and this has to do with maybe an awareness of your own genitals. Freud talks about resolving what's called the Oedipus Electra complex. If you ever seen a Greek tragedy where somebody falls in love with their mom or their dad, I guess it's resolving feelings towards mom and dad during those years. The latency period, 6 to 12 years, it's asterisk because he thought the latency period is not really a psychosexual stage because libido is not focused on the body. Therefore, fixation is impossible. But the latency stage is basically where they're developing their defense mechanisms and identifying with their peers. The genital stage is 12 years on, and this is where they achieve mature sexual intimacy. So Freud said adults who have successfully integrated earlier stages should emerge with sincere interest in others and mature sexually. So if you notice at this table, at each stage, the libido centers on different parts of the body. Erik Erikson was actually a student of Freud, and so Neo-Freudian means it's following along the area of Freud. He developed what's called psychosocial theory. Cool thing about psychosocial theory as opposed to psychosexual theory, he basically labels it how we're influenced by cultural demands and internal drives. Each stage requires a resolution of a crisis. So you either have healthy development, where you have a favorable ratio of positive to negative experiences, or you have an unhealthy development and the crisis is not quite settled. He also had stage theory with each of these crises, which is the foundation from childhood to adult. So every adult would have to go through these stages, or a child would have to go through these stages to move to adulthood. Also, his stages are not strongly tied to age. So if you will compare these two theories, the strengths of Freud's talks about the importance of experiences in infancy and early childhood, where in Erikson's strengths is he included the role of culture and personality development. The negative ones for Freud is he made sexual feelings primary, where Erikson described each period in terms of a single crisis, which may be oversimplified. Classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov, is a learning process that occurs through associations between environmental stimulus and naturally occurring stimulus. So he had what's called the reflex stimulus is a response connection. The unconditioned stimulus elicits unconditioned response. For instance, the sight of food automatically elicits what's called salivation in dogs. And so what he did is he paired ringing a bell with presenting food to the dog. And so what's normally an unconditioned stimulus, he was able to create a conditioned stimulus. So when he heard the bell, it would create salivation. That's called classical conditioning. So a conditioned response is made as it's paired with another event. Okay, this is, back. Erickson's psychosocial stages. I forgot to show that earlier. I gotta rearrange these slides. But it shows that the first stage is trust versus mistrust. The child learns is, can I trust my parent to take care of me? The next stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Am I a good person, or should I be ashamed of who I am? And usually abuse during these crucial times is what can cause students or children not to advance from these stages. Initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion. Teenagers are dealing with intimacy versus isolation, and adults deal with generativity versus stagnation, midlife crisis, I guess, integrity versus despair. In the classroom, school refusal, this can be applied, the classical conditioning can be applied to what's called school refusal. A lot of students don't come to school because they use what's called, they pair going to school with a lot of anxiety. Now Rollins uses what's called systematic desensitization by teaching relaxation strategies paired with coming to school. Gradually, the child will learn to associate going to school with relaxation instead of with being anxious. So how could a systematic desensitization be used to help a child who was once bitten by a dog overcome or fear of all dogs? This happened to me once. I got bit by a German Shepherd. Now every time I see a German Shepherd, I get all anxious. So what I could do, what actions could we do, is maybe every time I see a German Shepherd dog, I could be pairing it with some positive food or something like that. And after a while, I wouldn't have the same anxiety when I'm around a German Shepherd dog. Skinner developed on what's called operant conditioning, and it's modifying voluntary behavior. Basically, learning theory is based on every behavior is dependent on reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is anything that will increase the behavior. It's a positive thing that happens after the behavior, and if this happens, it'll probably increase the behavior. For instance, most of you who have a job have a paycheck. So because you get positive reinforcement, you will keep going to work. Negative reinforcement is more of a punishment that follows behavior. So if every time I look at a certain person, they punch me in the arm, I would eventually decrease that behavior because I do not like getting punched in the arm. So that would be a negative reinforcement for the behavior and will lead to decreasing behavior. Punishment is behavior that will reduce the behavior. Okay. It stops undesired behavior. Now, extinction is stopping unwanted behavior through repeated non-reinforcement. For instance, a teacher might use what's called planned ignoring or extinction of a student's negative behavior because the student is reinforced by attention. So if a student is always acting silly in class, the teacher might use planned ignoring at the time so as not to reinforce the negative behavior with positive attention. So hints for parents: positive and negative reinforcements interact in complex ways. In other words, best chance for behavior change exists with an appropriate consequence admitted right after the behavior occurs. If you ever tour Boys Town, they use learning theory. Every student has a point card, and on their point card they have their behavior, and then positive points and negative points. So if a student would do something positive, a teacher would say, go ahead and put down 1,000 points for following instructions. They'd write following instructions, positive points. If later in the day they don't follow instructions, they would earn negative points. So the key for learning theory is the students are reinforced for positive and negative behaviors with a consequence immediately following the behavior. And that's the most effective way to teach a student. Next, Albert Bandura came up with what's called social cognitive theory. And he said learning from a model is not always automatic. Self-efficacy plays a big part. Observational learning or modeling learning results from seeing a model reinforced or punished for their behavior. You probably notice in a classroom, a teacher might use what's called a sacrificial lamb, and a kid's acting out in behavior, and they would call on that student and maybe write them a detention for their inappropriate behavior. That watching modeling that student being reinforced or punished might affect the rest of the class. Okay, but it's dependent on 4 factors: attention, what the person is paying attention to; memory, are they able to remember the event; physical capabilities, are they physically able to imitate the behavior; and motivation, and that changes with age. This shows the importance of mentoring, of having a positive role model to emulate. Perceived self-efficacy. That's people's beliefs about their capability to produce effects. This is where person's learning, they're influenced by perceived similarity to the model. It's not limited to the overt behavior. It comes also from ideas, expectations, internal standards, and self-concepts. This compares, oops, we already showed that slide. Next is Piaget's cognitive theory. Jean Piaget in 1952 presented these theories. Basically what he found out is that he was struck that all children go through the same sequence of discoveries, making the same mistakes and arriving at the same solutions at different age groups when working with intelligence tests. So we know students were making similar mistakes on intelligence tests. He came up with called a scheme, which is internal cognitive structure, where we form a repertoire of skills. He coined the term assimilation, where we use a scheme to make sense of the experiences, and we tend to generalize, assimilate. Accommodation is where we change a scheme as a result of new information. And then equilibration is balancing assimilation and accommodation. Okay, this shows the stages. The first stage is sensor motor, which is birth to 18 months. And this is where the child is using their sensory and motor schemes to act on the world around them. From 18 months to 6 years is a symbolic scheme, and that's where the child really focuses on language and communication skills. This is a great time to introduce a new language as well. 6 through 12 years of age, that's where they reach the concrete operational stage. This is where they learn to think logically. 12 years and beyond is a formal operational stage. This is where the child develops abstract ideas. They're able to think about hypothetical situations and manage what-if questions. Vygotsky developed what's called social cultural theory. This involves complex forms of thinking, have their origins in social interactions, not private explorations. So children learn new cognitive skills when guided by a more skilled partner. So this shows the importance of an adult or an older sibling to teach a skill. The ZPD, or zone of proximal development, has to do with creating an appropriate scaffold. keeping the child's attention, modeling the best strategy, and adapting to the child's developmental level. Scaffolding is structuring the learning experience and discovery through questions, demonstrations, and explanations, using a process of learning and reteaching. The importance of assisted discovery. A child integrates the results of independent discoveries with new knowledge, taught in a systematic and structured way. So what are educational applications of this kind of learning? I think one is to be able to provide a scaffolding for learning from a model teacher, and then also to make sure to use that zone of proximal development of the child to keep the child's attention and to adapt to the child's proper developmental level. So educational applications should support exploration opportunities and discovery of what knowledge, skills, and understandings have not yet surfaced for the learner, or on the edge of emergence. A lot of times when you teach a new subject, it's important to start with where the students are at and tie in some information from their own schema, their own experience that they can apply the knowledge to. Information process theory. This is like if you ever look at a computer, it uses a model to explain how the mind manages information. There's that three-stage theory of memory. You sense, you have your sensory memory, your short-term memory, and your long-term memory. A good example of sensory memory is when you hear a word on a computer, that would be like any input. Like the input could be the internet, a scanner, anything that's, or a keyboard or the mouse. The short-term memory is kind of like your memory where all the information is processed. On a computer, it'd be your RAM memory, it's your working memory. Long-term memory would be where the information is permanently stored. That's considered your ROM memory, like CD, DVD, hard drive, flash drive. That'd be your long-term memory. This shows the information processing system. We sense things, we process them, and then we commit it to long-term memory or we forget it. There's some what's called neo-Piagetian theories, Piagetian informational processing hybrid, where we use the IP to explain Piaget stages. Expands rather than contradicts his theories, agrees that children's thinking reflects developing internal mental structures. It draws on linguistic theories about content, domain, specificity of cognition. So cognitive theories has their strengths and weaknesses. Piaget's strengths is it helps understand children at different ages, how they think and act on the world. The weakness is not every child follows stages in a certain order. Not everyone follows that stage theory. Information process theory helps us to explain how much information people at different ages can manage and how they process it. Weaknesses, it's much more complex than that of a computer. And then Vygotsky's social cultural theory, it's important to incorporate group learning processes, the importance of models, but there's insufficient evidence to support most ideas. Piaget's clever research. This is where he used like a ball of clay versus a roll of clay, or they used a taller container and then they pour the water into a wide container where it looks it's only half full, but it's the same amount of water. He would use this to study conservation and understanding matter does not change in quantity when its appearance changes. Oops, go back. And he would, the question was about employing follow-up questions. The criticism is Piaget did not ask the same question of each child in these in this experiment. The questions were not standardized, yet the results were quite striking. Later, better conceptualized research confirmed many Piaget's findings. To what extent were Piaget's methods influenced by children's language skills? How might older children's more highly developed capacity for reflecting on and explaining their thought process have influenced children's capacity for logical thinking? And those are some questions you can ask yourself. Next is a concept of behavioral genetics. This examines the genetic underpinnings of behavioral phenotypes. Can you think of questions that might be addressed using this theoretical perspective? Keep in mind, heredity affects a broad range of traits and behaviors, and its influence is seen throughout the lifespan. Some questions addressed is does heredity affect individual differences? How are similar traits of related people affected by genes? Can a child's pattern of inherited qualities influence how she behaves with others? So the focus is on the effect of heredity and individual differences. Up until now, we looked at the importance of the environment, but psychology also looks at genetics as well. Genetic makeup also influences the environment. For instance, college-educated parents will provide different experiences for their kids. Each child's inherited qualities affects the way he or she behaves with other people and how others respond to them as well. Oops, changed the page. Okay, so if you look at these studies from several students of Dutch twins, the cool thing about identical twins is they have the same genetic makeup. And notice there's a higher correlation with identical twins compared to fraternal twins who have the same environment but not the same genetic makeup. So there's a higher correlation, which says genetics does play a part. So this study from Postuma de Goss in 2003, you'll notice that in childhood, when fraternal twins share the same environment, their IQ scores are more strongly correlated. When they presumably no longer live together, by contrast, the IQ scores of identical twins are even more strongly correlated. So this pattern suggests conclusions about both heredity and environment. Specifically, at least with regard to IQ scores, the influence of heredity appears to increase with age, while that of environment declines. Next is ethology and sociobiology. Ethology examines genetically determined mechanisms that promote survival through natural selection. You've probably seen the idea of imprinting. That's where an animal bonds with a mature member of the species, like ducks. Within 48 hours of hatching, need to imprint and have that following instinct. Or after 48 hours, they don't latch on to somebody. So it's important for that imprinting. So that's basically programmed behavior, instinctual behavior. It's not learned. Sociobiology considers the application of evolutionary theory to social behavior. In other words, certain behaviors are basically inborn. For instance, a baby crying. Your author suggests that's genetically programmed behavior. This behavior might be irritating, but it causes the caretaker to respond, and the interaction forms an emotional bond, the baby with the parent. The critique is it tends to underestimate the impact of environment, which goes to what's called a nature versus nurture debate. What's more important in the development of a child? Is it their biological nature, in their instinctual behavior, evolutionary things that are passed on, or is nurturing more important? The environment they grew up in, and their background, their experiences. Now, Yuri Bronfenbrenner came up with what's called a bioecological theory. The importance of this is it captures the complexity of individual and contextual variables. And it shows the need for research, the examining interactions among these variables. So when you look at development, you got to look at the macro system, which is like the values and beliefs, okay, that may affect development. The exosystem, which is social, economic environment which the child grew up in. The microsystem has to do with family, school, religion, neighborhood. And the mesosystem has to do with the interconnectedness between those components. And then the biological is the genetic makeup. So Bronfenbrenner, 1979, really points out the importance of understanding this total context. This little chart here kind of shows the model of the different contexts and how they influence who we are. So his biological theory has helped researchers better understand how families moderate the effects of potentially damaging experiences, such as living in a refugee camp or on child's development. So it's important to think about. For instance, I was a coach and I had a few kids who were refugees from a camp. And some of them really witnessed and experienced some terrible things. Some students tend to really, for some reason they tend to adapt well to the United States and learning language, adjusting to the culture. Some students have another refugee student I worked with kind of got involved in gangs early on in his life and kind of moved him on a totally different path compared to his counterpart who was adjusting well and doing well in school. So assumptions about development are, is it active or is it passive? And this has to do with cognitive learning theory. Is a person active in shaping their own development, or are they a passive recipient of the environmental influences? Is it nature or nurture? Is it the biology versus the environment causing the person to develop the way they do? Is it stability or change? Stability has to do with development happening continuously, or does it happen in stages? Okay, this is just a summary of all of our theories of development that we've talked about. Some focus on a passive, that development is passive based on environment, nature, or both, nature or nurture. Some are focused on stage theories, some don't. They're more continuous. And so it kind of has a little comparison of all the theories we just went over. Okay, now what your book talks about is instead of looking at each of these theories as right or wrong, or useful or not useful, it's important to notice that each theory is very important to provide a different perspective on the same thing. What's important is that each theory does help us generate predictions that can be tested. They also have what's called a heuristic value. In other words, it stimulates thinking and research. Next is the practical value of each of these theories. Do they provide solutions to problems? Next is explanation of basic developmental facts. The key is not to conclude which one is true, but to figure out how does each reveal a comprehensive understanding of human development. And finally, our last slide, eclecticism. This is basically a multiple theoretical approach. It contributes to the development of more comprehensive theories to support research questions and hypotheses. Eclecticism is, I build on ideas from different sources. I avoid rigid adherence to just one theory. I contribute to development of more comprehensive theories. For instance, I tend to have eclecticism when it comes to music. I love gospel music, rock and roll, country, classical. And the same approach we use towards psychology. We try to be interdisciplinary and learn from different resources to help us get the big picture. That concludes this chapter. Have a great week.